And I would like to now introduce our next speaker. We'll now hear from Dr. Jose Franco. Jose is a research agroecologist and agronomist at the USDA Dairy Forage Research Center and is the leader of the Precision Conservation Crop Lab. Today, Jose is going to share an update on cutting-edge cover crop research at the US Dairy Forage Research Center. Thank you for being with us today, Jose, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Dane. Just to confirm, you're saying my presenter view, correct?
Correct.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dane, and thank you for the invitation. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to folks today. So I'll be providing, so again, I'm Jose Franco, I'm a research agronomist with Dairy Forage Research Center. We're the USDA Agricultural Research Service. And we have a lot of really cool things going on with cover crops. We have new people. We're going to bring on newer people that are going to focus on things like cover crops, soil health, conservation cropping systems. So I have quite a bit to provide today in terms of updates. So I'll get started. So for our center, the Dairy Forage Research Center, really one of the overarching goals is to improve production capacity, efficiency, and the economic environmental sustainability of diverse integrated dairy production systems. So we consider ourselves really a leader in sort of integrated dairy forage systems research. So we look at everything from the forages, nutrition, and the environment. And I'll be talking a little bit about each of those today. And for my program, I lead the Precision Conservation Crop Lab, and two of my overarching goals for my lab are to develop and refine management strategies and tools to overcome limitations and basically get more cover crops on the landscape. And also to diversify dairy forage cropping systems to reduce the environmental impact while providing quality feed for dairy production. So how do we achieve this? I'll talk about some projects, but essentially one is the inclusion of diverse cover crops and also alternative forages and crops that can be used both for conservation purposes, but also as a value-added resource for forages, and also utilizing precision technology tools and also developing agronomic strategies to optimize the hows, wheres, when we get those cover crops and conservation crops on the landscape. Really, the end goal here is to reduce the risk for growers so that they can feel more confident to integrate conservation crops and cover crops on their farms. So the first project that I'll cover briefly is what we call the winter cover crops for spring forage. And so we're looking at alternatives to cereal rye monocultures. And this is a 3-year experiment. So we are just wrapping up our 3rd year. I won't present a ton of data, but by the end of the year, we'll have a nice, hopefully a paper out and data out that summarize our findings. So this is being replicated at our research farm just north of Prairie du Sac, Wisconsin, which is in Sauk County, and then also up in Marshfield, Wisconsin. So we're trying to get a distribution of environments with this project. And the cover crops that we're looking at are winter cereal rye, winter triticale, hairy vetch, and winter camelina. So what we have are monocultures of each of those species, and then we're with our small grains, we're adding in the hairy vetch. So we have a biculture, and then in the 3 species mixtures, we're adding in camelina mixture. So as Dane mentioned from the Wisconsin Citizen Science, Cover Crop Citizen Science Project, more and more producers are interested in mixtures and alternatives to just cereal rye. And so we're hoping that this project will provide some valuable data for growers. So what are we measuring? So we're measuring spring forage production. We are running a series of nutritive and forage quality metrics. We're looking at soil nutrient uptake from these different cover crops, looking at pollinator resources in the spring, and then also, and really the ultimate goal of this project is how do we reduce any potential negative effect on the next corn crop? So we're measuring corn silage yield after these cover crops are taken off for forage. So I'll just quickly go over a couple of don't mind the figures. Essentially, what I wanted to show here is something that we tried with winter camelina. So one year we decided to try planting that at different dates at our research farm to see what impact that had on flowering resources and basically visitation from pollinators the next spring. So the reason we want the reason we're interested in winter camelina are essentially one, there are very few floral resources early in the spring, that especially in agricultural fields. So winter camelina can provide a floral resource. And two, if I'm a producer and I'm interested in diversifying and also potentially reducing any impact on my next corn crop, this could be a potential alternative to rye. So what we found from this is so we planted at 3 different dates. We planted in mid-September, late September, and then mid-October. And what we found was with the earlier plantings, we got earlier floral resources in the spring, right? So the earlier you plant, at least in September, you can get more floral resources in the spring. And that does translate to more pollinator visitation. A couple of interesting things that we saw from this data, and this is data from Eliza Pesaro, who was a master's student in Dr. Claudio Graton's lab at UW. And one thing that we observed was that pollinators actually had a preference for camelina flowers over dandelion flowers. As we know, in the spring, can be a lot of dandelions like this spring. And so a lot of folks think, well, why do we need something like camelina if we have things like dandelion and other flowering weeds, and actually prefer something like a camelina over dandelion. So this is what that they look like in the spring. I believe this was probably early April. This was taken. So that's the early camelina on the left, later planted camelina on the right. And then this is what they look like by later in April. You can see that earlier planting is obviously a lot farther along. The only caveat here is that you can plant winter camelina too early. You don't want to plant too early because it won't survive the winter very well. So why does this matter? Why do we care about this? Or again, I said, we don't have a lot of floral resources in the spring, but also if we're not testing this with this project, but if we're interested in doing a double crop system with camelina, like there has been some work with camelina soybean in Minnesota and Illinois, it stands to reason that the earlier planted camelina should reach maturity more quickly the following year, allowing more time to get another crop in that year. And just a quick rundown, I won't go into great detail. This is just from 1 year worth of the data. We have 3 years now, so this might change, but so far what we're seeing is including camelina in the mixtures doesn't seem to negatively impact both biomass production, nor does it seem to impact forage quality parameters. So for example, crude protein, which I highlight in yellow, numerically, we're actually seeing slight increases in crude protein when we include the vetch and then we include camelina. The statistics don't say they're different, but at least numerically, we're seeing that. So we're also testing any potential anti-nutritional components of including camelina. So we want to be sure that what we're feeding the livestock is not going to do any harm to the livestock, right? And then lastly, we're also very interested in seeing how replacing or adding to a reliable winter cover crop like cereal rye impacts that next corn crop, right? Which is the ultimate goal of this project. So that's kind of a segue into some of the other work that I've done. And so we know that planting day can be really critical for certain species, right? And one of the things I hear a lot from farmers is, I just don't have time to get in there and plant a cover crop. So right now, my program is looking at things like aerial seeding with drones. We're looking at robotic interseeder, working with a company this year, launching a project this summer, where we're looking at how drone seeding and using technology like robots can give us a little more flexibility for when we can get those cover crops in, but also get greater establishment with these techniques, and also free up some of that time for farmers, because a lot of this would be done by contract. And there are a lot of drone companies now that are contracting aerial seeding of cover crops. So that picture in the middle there is some cover crops that we interseeded this year in a trial. So that's annual ryegrass, there's kale, there's turnips, and there's radish and red clover in that corn crop there. So basically with that, we just modified our small plot no-till drill and got those cover crops drilled at the V4 to V5 stage of corn. So I'm doing a lot of work on this, sort of refining the agronomics to make sure that we can get good establishment, provide more flexibility for the species selection. And also, we're also doing a lot of work on farm. So I'm working with a few folks, including Sand County Foundation, UW Extension, and others to do some of this work, to evaluate this work on farms. So here's a picture of some, and this was mostly done for demonstration. Picture on the left was drone seeded rye. So that was seeded last fall. We did replicated plots on that at different times and also different seeding rates. So I believe that was about 45 to 50 pounds per acre on the left there. And we're using, well, we have this sort of plot scale drone seeder with a small hopper on the bottom. You see that picture in the middle. So we got pretty good establishment with that rye cover crop last fall, actually. And then on the right was a field that we drone seeded rye and a camelina mixture. And you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but there are some yellow flowers in there. So you can see the camelina coming up through that cover crop. So we actually got pretty good establishment last fall with our drone seeding. So I'm going to move on to sort of a more systems evaluation of dairy forage systems. So we're looking at intermediate wheatgrass, which is it's a perennial grain crop, and we want to see how it compares with other traditional and emerging dairy forage production systems. And this is where cover crops tie in. So we're looking at a number of metrics. We're looking at productivity, resilience, soil health, carbon balance, greenhouse gas emissions, fossil energy footprint, and profitability. And what we're doing is comparing 6 systems. And this is set up as a sort of a medium, I would say medium-term project, where we're looking at continuous corn silage with a fall cover crop, continuous corn silage with interseeded cover crops, which was the photo that I showed you earlier. A winter wheat followed by a cover crop mixture that same year, followed by corn silage and soybean rotation, alfalfa, and then intermediate wheatgrass. So we're looking at a gradient of cover crop diversity or crop diversity and continuous living cover, including cover crops in 2 different management strategies of integrating cover crops into corn. So a lot of this was, some of these systems were very much informed by what we're hearing from farmers and also what we're hearing from folks like Dan Smith and others from Extension that helped kind of inform some of our treatment selection here. So now I'm going to move on to some of what my colleagues here, some of our animal nutritionists have shared. So we're doing quite a bit of work on feeding cover crops now. We just don't have a lot of information on how feeding cover crops affects milk production and other metrics. So we're starting a few feeding studies evaluating cover crops with lactating dairy cows here at our center. After talking to our animal nutritionists, the cows seem to be liking the diet, so that's a good sign. So really the objective here is to evaluate 4 types of cover crops to high producing dairy cows for 8 weeks. So we're looking at milk yield, intake, milk composition, nutrient digestibility, rumination, and methane emissions from these different cover crops. And we're looking at some of the cover crops from the winter cover crop trial I just described. We're looking at cereal rice, triticale, rye plus vetch, and camelina, and then triticale, carry vetch, and camelina. So this is a study where they're including cover crops at a 15% inclusion rate. And that just started last week, actually, this study. Another scientist here is doing some mini silo experiments with some of these cover crops to look at things like detergent fiber, volatile fatty acids, and gas production from the different cover crops being ensiled. So how well do these different cover crops ensile? And then finally, that first project was focused on more kind of peak or mid lactation, and this is focused on early lactation. So very similarly, at different inclusion rates, we're looking at rye, triticale, and those 2 mixtures that I described. And Dr. French is looking at milk yield and composition, enteric gas production, blood metabolite analysis, microbiome analysis, and fecal and urine analysis. So we're really trying to cover the whole system here in dairy systems with cover crops. And then finally, we have two grass breeders here. So we have two annual cover crop breeders, one focused on legumes and another one that's new, Dr. Lisa Kissing-Kusik, who is working on annual grasses. And they're part of a national cover crop breeding network that includes replicated plot research trials around the country, but it also includes on-farm breeding trials and some advanced line trials. And they're working on cover crops like winter pea, hairy vetch, crimson clover, cereal rye, and then some brassicas as well. And these are some of the, this sort of summarizes some of the traits that they're breeding for each of the cover crop species. So for instance, with cereal rye, they're breeding for allelopathy, drought and cold emergence, forage applications, and hairy vetch, they're breeding for soft-seeded hairy vetch, low shatter, low toxicity for feeding, and doing some brassica work, which just started this year. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So we are really looking at the whole system, everything from breeding cover crops to sort of agronomic applications, how they fit into dairy systems, how do we reduce the risk, how do we get more flexibility with how we include them in rotations, and then also how do they compare in terms of ecosystem services, right? How do they compare in terms of soils, in terms of greenhouse gases, and then also what does it look like when you feed those cover crops to animals? We just don't know enough about that. So that's all I have for today.
All right, thank you, Jose. That was great. It's really nice to see this, kind of comprehensive systems approach to some of these tougher problems in dairy systems. So your research is certainly valuable, and we appreciate you sharing with us today. We've got a little bit of time for questions, but before we get into that, just a bit of housekeeping. If you'd like to earn a CEU for today, please post your name and CCA number in the chat or email Sam Bibby. His email will be posted in the chat as well. We'll also post a CCA CEU credit sign-in QR code in the chat, so keep a lookout for that. All right, so with our last 5 minutes, are there any questions? We're happy to take them from the audience, or please post them in the chat if you're interested. I can get us going here. I actually do have a question for Jose. Being an entomologist, of course, I'm interested in the pollinator study. So I'm curious. It's really interesting to see that camelina was actually a preferred flower for some of our pollinators. Were you actually looking at whether they were native pollinators or the European honeybee? Did you parse that out at all? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, and I mean that's sort of Eliza's area, but I will say what I know about it is we kind of broke them up into morphological groups, Dane, and I know Eliza did do a survey of what was out there. So we have a sense of what's considered native and what's considered sort of managed bees. So we do have that. I don't know, however, whether that preference applied to all bees or all pollinators across the board. And there were a lot of syrphids and flies as well that we considered a different category of pollinator. But yeah, I don't know if that applies to every single group, but I think overall is what we're seeing is that they do prefer camelina over dandelion.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, nice to have some floral resources for pollinators out there early in the season if possible. And if cover crops are one way to accomplish that, that's really positive. Looks like we have a question in the chat. Jose, this one might be for you as well. How does the root biomass of winter camelina compare to some of our other common cover crops?
That's a great question. It's not going to put on as much biomass, right? It's typically with the brassicas, you're going to get more of a taproot and less sort of fibrous roots that we typically see with things like rye and other grasses. So that's where I think the interesting thing is, and we hope to have the soil nutrient data all analyzed here by the end of the year to evaluate how camelina compares in terms of that nutrient uptake, which obviously that root biomass is going to impact greatly, right? But overall, less roots, more of a sort of taproot. But we might see the benefit is maybe in those mixtures, right, where you have different types of root morphologies in the soil rather than just one type.
Thank you. That was a great answer and a great question there, coming in from the chat. Well, it looks like a lot of the CCA numbers are coming in, so thank you again for providing those. Yes, and with that, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to really thank again Jose and Steve for joining us today and sharing your expertise. It's great to have such a good crew on for these Badger Crop Connect series.